Andrew Jackson, the 7th President of the United States, the first president of humble origin, was primarily associated with the frontier. Jackson's election to the highest office in 1828 was long regarded as a great victory for the common people. Jackson was the most popular president of America in the 19th century. He dominated American politics in the 1820s and 1830s. His political ambition, combined with widespread popular participation in politics, shaped the modern Democratic Party. Jackson's victory against the British in the Battle of New Orleans in 1815 won him kudos among the people of America. Renowned for his toughness, he was nicknamed Old Hickory and had given the nation a taste for military glory. Jackson was born on the 15th of March 1767 in a Scottish-Irish immigrant family in the Waxhaw settlement on the western frontier of South Carolina. During the American War of Independence, Jackson took up work as a messenger for the South Carolina military. He was only 13. When he was captured by the British soldiers and in prison, he refused to shine the boots of a British officer. His face was slashed with a sword. Who would have had even the slightest idea that that brave boy would one day become the 7th President of the United States? Jackson was orphaned at the age of 14 and was brought up by an uncle who was a well-to-do slave owner. As a result, the young Jackson moved among wealthy speculators and property owners, men who monopolized prestige and political influence in the back country. Young Jackson had all the qualities of a typical prairie boy of the southern soil. Dr. Chittabrata Palit, the eminent historian, portrays Jackson as a typical American cowboy.
Jackson was a typical American cowboy, a pistolero, whose friendship was only with the ranchers and with land speculators, land sharks like William Blount and others. And he drank, he gambled, he hunted, all the typical vices of the prairie boy. And in this kind of land speculation and lottery, he made a lot of money. And with this money, his sole ambition was to buy land and more land. He himself became a giant landholder ultimately through this process. And while he waxed in this way, he virtually robbed the properties of many of his less fortunate Western brothers. So he rose at the expense of poorer relatives, poorer friends. That was his spectacular rise.
Andrew Jackson consequently became a lawyer at the age of 20. As a prosecuting attorney in Nashville, Tennessee, he showed no sympathy for debtors defaulting on their mortgage payments. Blessed with great courage and an iron will that inspired fear and respect among those who crossed his path, Jackson quickly became one of the leaders in the new state of Tennessee. His marriage to Rachel Donaldson Robards cast a shadow on Jackson's career and his social standing. Ironically, the couple was unaware at the time of their marriage that Rachel's divorce from her first husband had not yet been technically completed. So his political enemies thereafter referred to the couple as adulterers. After helping to draft the Tennessee Constitution in 1796, Jackson was elected the state's first congressman, serving 1 year in the U.S. House of Representatives and then for a year in the U.S. Senate. Feared for his volatile temper and his prowess as a duelist, Jackson was elected Major General of the Tennessee Militia in 1802. As an ambitious man, however, he longed to play a greater part in the nation's affairs. The outbreak of the War of 1812 provided this opportunity. On the 8th of January 1815, Jackson's motley army won an amazingly one-sided victory at New Orleans over a British army. Euphoria swept the nation after Jackson's victory at the Battle of New Orleans. Overnight, Jackson became a national hero. Optimism and hope among the American people ran high with the firm control established by the Democratic Republic Party at the center. The constituency of Jackson was mainly rural, and it was large compared to what Jefferson had. Jefferson still had to depend on eastern border states, the maritime states of United States. He had to depend on business tycoons and also the leading lawyers, whereas Jackson had no such hang-ups.
He was a person who was a common man's choice, a mass leader. At the same time, he could exert authority over all concerned. So he had that trait in him, both an authority and a champion of liberty. Andrew Jackson is a man of destiny. He has been described by many textbook writers as a man of destiny as well. Somehow he fitted the bill. People thought that he was the right man at the right time of history. Again, the same phrase, child of his times. He was like that. He was a man of a different sort and a man of great experience. When it comes to government, he is 63. So he had a tremendous experience. He has seen the best of times, he has seen the worst of times. So such was Andrew Jackson.
So significant was his presidential tenure, 1829 to 1837, that many textbooks have often described it as the age of Jackson.
Andrew Jackson's presidency involved the deepening and broadening of democracy in the United States. During the period of Jefferson and his successors, American politics had come to be linked with caucuses, small groups associated with the Republican Party working in state legislatures and in the houses of Congress. Andrew Jackson broke the power of these small groups. He did this through three major initiatives. The first was the demand that all party activity be subject to national conventions. Members who were involved at an everyday level in party life would in future select candidates, whether it be for the Senate or whether it be for the House of Representatives or whether it be for state legislatures. Small groups would no longer determine these matters. Secondly, the administration that existed under each president and the administration which the party could affect jobs of various types would in future change with the arrival of each new elected team. Andrew Jackson argued that the business of government was easily conducted by anybody. There required to be no specialization, no continuity in experience. He therefore opened the civil service out to practically all and sundry who were associated with politics. The third major feature which requires to be mentioned is that during his 2 terms as President of the United States, he was also able to ensure that practically all levels of government became elected at a popular level, whether it be governors or whether it be senators, as well as the original members of the House of Representatives and the Houses of Congress. So that broadening of American democracy, which we find as its most exciting characteristic, was achieved at this time and has remained in place until today.
A fair estimate of Andrew Jackson's presidency requires the assessment of all the measures and changes that he had effected within the government. During the first term of his presidency, he accomplished a lot for the betterment of the nation. One such act was the measure he took against the Bank of United States, situated in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Nicholas Biddle, the president of the bank, was one of the most powerful men in the United States of America during that period. He was so powerful that he was almost a kingmaker and nicknamed Tsar Nicholas.
The Bank of United States had so much tax money, and also the savings of the businessmen, that that Tsar Nicholas could do anything he would like. That's why Jackson got determined to liquidate this bank and put federal money in his chosen 32 state banks. He decided to put federal money into state banks and dissolved the Bank of United States, which was a money monopoly, which was money trust for United States. And he was so determined that in driblets, actually money was withdrawn from the federal bank and money was put into his pet state banks. And his argument was that federal bank, that is the Bank of United States, only offered money as loan to the businessmen and the great gentlemen farmers. Money did not reach the frontier. Money did not reach agriculture. Money did not reach middle class or poor people. Money only was concentrated in the hands of few already rich people, and this was absolutely undemocratic. So there was necessity for distribution of wealth of the United States. So as a measure, it was very democratic, not only democratic, it was very radical at the same time as a measure. And to disturb this measure, Nicholas Biddle artificially called a loan. Called a loan means withdrawn money for their purposes. Before the bank was totally liquidated, a lot of money was taken in loan by the businessmen, his friends and cronies. They took a lot of money, and an artificial crisis was created, financial crisis was created in the country. And against that kind of thing, Jackson had to fight. The country's economy was shaken, sort of staggering. That was due to conspiracy, and also that when you put money into unknown quarters, the financial stability is lost. And to be very honest with history, I can say that the 32 paid banks that he trusted in did not really respond to his good wishes. Many of them also flunked. Many of them also did malpractice. And therefore, some federal money was not to be even traced afterwards. They were simply squandered by some of his paid banks. And later on, there was some kind of a movement called Locofocoism during his period. And these wildcat banks ultimately had to be given up. Again, money was strolling back to a central bank, federal bank. So we can say this measure was a half-cocked measure, but at least for the first term of his office, for the first 4 years, it had done immense good to the country. It had put blood into the veins of all America, which was not there before, and it had led to economic wealth, economic progress of the entire nation.
Another measure taken by Jackson during his presidential term was the reduction of the protective tariff, better known as the Nullification Crisis.
Among the various problems that Jacksonian democracy faced, the Nullification Crisis was certainly an important one. What was at issue here was, whose democracy was this? Was this the democracy of the president or the democracy of the states? The nullification crisis centered around a very simple problem. A tariff was passed by the President of the United States, which was an attempt to establish a compromise between the manufacturers of New England and the North and the farmers of the West and the landowners of the South. A tariff which was neither too high nor too low. The representatives of the South, however, considered that even though this tariff was a compromise and better than what had gone before, it was still not acceptable. Stating their position, the legislators of South Carolina decided to nullify the tariff, hence the term Nullification Crisis. The President's decision was not acceptable to the state of South Carolina, and it was argued South Carolina was merely expressing its own right as a state of the United States to take action on behalf of the interests that that state represented and the citizens of that state. Jackson, on the other hand, argued on behalf of the democracy of the United States. The tariff ultimately could not be defied, he argued, by an individual state and threatened to invade South Carolina. Finally, as a result of a degree of maneuver, manipulation, and negotiation in the House of Representatives, the crisis was brought to an end. But it had touched on an extremely sensitive issue.
Maysville Road veto is another small but very interesting issue Jackson handled during his first presidency.
Tennessee, from which he came as a candidate, Tennessee and neighboring state Kentucky, they had no road link. There was no federal road connecting the two. In the interest of business and movement of people, it became necessary that Maysville, one town in Kentucky, be connected with Nashville, one town in Tennessee. The people of these two states said that they would build their portion of the road. They would not take any federal money, and they would have full control over the section that they had built. So Kentucky people would say that they would construct that part of the road to the border from Maysville, and Tennessee people said that they would build the road from Nashville to the border, and then these two could be joined. They still wanted to be intrastate, and they would not like to be interstate in any way. They did not like any federal intervention in national road building, national highway building. They didn't have that idea. Now Jackson has to take the decision. Jackson must decide whether it will be a national highway, whether federal funding would go for it, or whether he would have to depend at the mercy of these two states. Jackson thought that it was a very high national issue, high importance, and therefore the health of the nation depended on this. It cannot be a state subject. It had to be a federal subject, and therefore he ordered that this road, trunk road, would be constructed by the center, and a funding would be from the federal government and not from the states. And states would have no authority over the states, over this road. And so consequently this road was built out of federal funds controlled by the federal government, and states' rights were sacrificed, including his home constituency, that is Tennessee. This shows another thing, that he would rise to the occasion. When the national need arose, he would become a nationalist, a federalist, and he would not really sink down into state rights because this was a hometown or home constituency. He would not do that. So that shows his greatness, his experience, his practicality. These things are shown in this small episode known as the Maysville Road Veto.
A significant blot on the otherwise spectacular career of Andrew Jackson remains the way he handled the indigenous Red Indians or Amerindians.
Cherokees, one of the early Red Indian tribes of America, they were settled in the state of Georgia. They were very civilized, highly educated, and they had passed their own constitution as Cherokee nation. They wanted Georgia to be the country, the land of the Cherokees. But Jackson was not with them. Jackson thought Georgia had now become a very flourishing state. It has taken all the benefits from the federal government, and therefore it should be very much under federal government and should be for all kinds of people, not a reserved constituency of the Cherokee people. It should be for all people. The gates of Georgia should be thrown open to people migrating from the east to the west. This was the story of inner expansion. The whole Illinois was being colonized at that time. This was the time when Illinois was born. So Jackson was all in favor of that. The people should be allowed to migrate to this new land. And that was the secret of wealth of America. And free movement should be allowed for democratic America. But Cherokees clung to their rights. They would not budge. They could not be whisked away by the federal troops. It was not inhuman. So a fight was on with the federal government and the Cherokee nation. Jackson didn't sympathize with the Cherokees, and ultimately they took the case to the Supreme Court before John Marshall, the great Federalist judge. Marshall, in his verdict, said that Jackson had been very high-handed in flushing out Cherokees from Georgia. At the same time, the Cherokees had been very arrogant by trying to maintain that it was their homeland. Both have done excessively. Therefore, he said that there should be a compromise. Not all Cherokees could be removed from their home, and Jackson was warned that he had taken a very high-handed measure by trying to force them out. They should be brought to conference table. After conciliation, after offering alternate homeland, they could be pushed out. Otherwise it would be inhuman. So John Marshall was very clever. He kept federal rights. At the same time, he also sympathized as a humanist the cause of the Cherokees. But Jackson was very adamant on this question, because all the early presidents, they thought America was for the whites. It was the white man's burden, which I had been saying all the time, right from the beginning. Cherokees to them, Red Indians to them, were not the true Americans. They were not whites. So he also lacked, though he was a great Republican, a great Democrat, even a better Democrat than Jefferson, not only by identity, but in practice. He came from humble origins. He was a prairie boy, I had already said that. Even then he had prejudice against the Red Indians. He would like to push them out of Georgia and secure that land for white people. He had no sympathy. This, I would say, is a great blot in the otherwise spectacular career of Andrew Jackson.
Yet, Jackson was re-elected for a second term in the year 1833, riding a crest of popularity.
And of course, the second presidency was taken up with entirely a different matter, westward expansion, particularly southwesterly expansion. The Texan immigration had started from 1823, when Gustavus Austin had pioneered Texas for the Americans. And in his trail, many Americans had gone there, outnumbering the Spaniards and other people who had already lived. And for this, there was increasing bitterness between the Mexican government and the American government. So his second presidency was more or less taken up with this question: of the westward movement, particularly to the southwest, the Great Texan Question, which would ultimately lead to the Mexican War of 1845. So he was busy with that.
Another measure taken by Jackson during his presidential term was the reduction of the protective tariff, better known as the Nullification Crisis.
Among the various problems that Jacksonian democracy faced, the Nullification Crisis was certainly an important one. What was at issue here was, whose democracy was this? Was this the democracy of the president or the democracy of the states? The Nullification Crisis centered around a very simple problem. A tariff was passed by the President of the United States, which was an attempt to establish a compromise between the manufacturers of New England and the North and the farmers of the West and the landowners of the South. A tariff which was neither too high nor too low. The representatives of the South, however, considered that even though this tariff was a compromise and better than what had gone before, it was still not acceptable. Stating their position, the legislatures of South Carolina decided to nullify the tariff, hence the term Nullification Crisis. The president's decision was not acceptable to the state of South Carolina, and it was argued South Carolina was merely expressing its own right as a state of the United States to take action on behalf of the interests that that state represented and the citizens of that state. Jackson, on the other hand, argued on behalf of the democracy of the United States. The tariff ultimately could not be defied, he argued, by an individual state and threatened to invade South Carolina. Finally, as a result of a degree of maneuver, manipulation, and negotiation in the House of Representatives, the crisis was brought to an end. But it had touched on an extremely sensitive issue.